Teddy Swims had been invited to The View as part of the promotional circuit for his latest album, expecting a light-hearted discussion about music, creativity, and his journey from small-town gigs to sold-out tours. But from the moment he sat down at the table, he sensed a tension in the air. Joy Behar, known for her sharp tongue and unapologetic style, locked eyes with him in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like she was preparing for a verbal sparring match. At first, the conversation flowed politely. Teddy spoke about how his soulful sound was born from blending gospel, R&B, and country influences, and Joy nodded, though her smile seemed tight. But then she abruptly shifted the topic, questioning whether his recent public comments about authenticity in the music industry were a veiled critique of mainstream pop artists. Teddy laughed nervously, insisting he meant no harm, yet his insistence on keeping it real seemed to touch a nerve. Joy leaned forward, pointing out that sometimes keeping it real was just another way of excusing bad behavior or unprofessionalism. The tension rose instantly, with the other co-hosts glancing between them as though trying to gauge whether to intervene. Teddy's expression shifted from amused to slightly defensive, his voice deepening as he explained that, in his world, honesty mattered more than polished image. Joy countered sharply, accusing him of being dismissive toward artists who worked hard to maintain their brand, and the air in the studio thickened as the audience shifted in their seats. The second segment began with an attempt to steer the conversation back to safer territory, but the undercurrent of conflict was impossible to ignore. Joy, apparently unwilling to let go of the earlier exchange, circled back with a pointed remark about Teddy's tattoos and personal style, suggesting that his image was carefully curated to appear authentic rather than actually being authentic. The implication hit Teddy like a slap. He chuckled awkwardly at first, but his eyes narrowed. "This is just me," he said firmly, gesturing to his clothes, his beard, and the ink on his arms. "I don't dress up to play a part. This is who I am, whether I'm on this stage or back home." Joy smirked, tilting her head as if unconvinced, and said, "Come on, everybody in this business plays a part." The audience gave a mix of laughter and gasps, sensing the friction escalating. One of the other hosts tried to mediate, interjecting with a question about Teddy's upcoming tour, but Joy was already leaning back in her chair, her body language radiating challenge. Teddy began describing the tour's concept, stripped-down shows focused on intimacy with the audience, but Joy interrupted again, asking whether intimacy was just another buzzword for selling tickets. That was when Teddy's tone turned noticeably colder, replying that maybe people who didn't understand his music shouldn't try to define it. The remark drew an audible "oh" from the crowd, and Joy's lips tightened. By the time the third segment rolled around, the atmosphere had shifted from awkward banter to something resembling open hostility. Teddy tried to answer audience questions, but Joy inserted small jabs into nearly every exchange, questioning his credibility, his work ethic, and even hinting that his sudden rise to fame might be the result of industry connections rather than pure talent. Teddy's patience began to fray, though he made a visible effort to remain composed. Still, his replies grew sharper, with less of the easy humor he was known for. At one point, Joy dismissed one of his heartfelt stories about struggling to pay rent before his big break, remarking, "We've all had to hustle. That's life. It doesn't make you special." The comment stunned Teddy into silence for a moment, and the audience murmured in discomfort. The cameras caught the flicker of anger in his eyes as he leaned toward her and said, "It's not about being special. It's about respecting where people come from." Joy rolled her eyes dramatically, and that small gesture seemed to push him even closer to the edge. The producers, sensing that the tension was now overshadowing the intended tone of the episode, scrambled behind the scenes, unsure whether to cut to commercial early, but Teddy stayed seated, hands clasped tightly, jaw set. The fourth segment was supposed to be a fun game, where Teddy and the hosts guessed lyrics from famous songs, but the energy in the room was already poisoned. Joy, still apparently irritated, used even the game as an opportunity to throw in little digs. When Teddy guessed a lyric incorrectly, she joked, "Guess you don't know music as well as you think." The audience laughed uncomfortably, aware that the humor carried an edge. Teddy gave a tight smile, muttering, "Yeah, hilarious, before focusing on the next question. But his frustration was beginning to show more clearly. Joy's laughter seemed louder than necessary, and her glances toward him were brief but loaded. Finally, during one particularly tense exchange, Teddy leaned back and muttered into his mic, "Man, you really don't like me, do you?" Joy replied instantly, "I don't dislike you. I just think you've got more ego than talent." The room erupted in shocked gasps, and the other hosts froze, unsure how to recover. Teddy's face darkened, and for the first time, he broke eye contact, staring down at the table for several seconds. The silence between them spoke volumes, and even Joy seemed to realize the weight of what she had just said. But instead of apologizing, she crossed her arms and waited for his reaction. Teddy's reaction came in the form of a quiet, deliberate challenge. He looked up slowly, met Joy's gaze, and said, "You don't have to like me, but you don't get to tell me who I am." His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. The audience, sensing the gravity of the moment, fell silent. Joy tried to wave it off with a dismissive gesture, but Teddy didn't let it slide. "I came here thinking we'd have an honest conversation," he continued, "but it feels like you showed up ready to tear me down." Joy smirked faintly, as if amused by the accusation, but didn't deny it. The tension had reached a point where even the other co-hosts seemed reluctant to speak, afraid of becoming collateral damage. Teddy's hands were no longer clasped. They were flat on the table, his posture leaning forward in a way that suggested he was ready to stand up at any moment. Producers gestured frantically off camera, trying to cue the hosts into wrapping things up or moving on. But neither Teddy nor Joy seemed willing to back down. The cameras stayed locked on them, capturing every flicker of expression as the standoff deepened. The sixth segment began with Whoopi Goldberg attempting to take control of the situation, her voice calm but firm as she redirected a question toward Teddy about the deeper meaning behind his lyrics. Teddy answered, but his responses were shorter now, clipped, as though each word had to fight its way past the frustration building inside him. Joy, however, couldn't resist adding commentary. "You talk like you're the first person to ever write about pain," she quipped, sipping her coffee without breaking eye contact. Teddy inhaled sharply through his nose, leaning forward. "Pain is universal, but how you tell it is personal," he replied. "I don't expect you to get that if you've never listened to my music beyond what's on the cue cards." The audience gave a mix of laughter and audible gasps, and Joy's eyebrows shot up. Whoopi quickly interjected, "Okay, let's stay on track." But Joy was already shaking her head. "That's your problem," she shot back at Teddy. "You think you're too deep for anyone to challenge." Teddy sat back, rubbing his hands over his face, muttering something under his breath that wasn't picked up clearly by the microphones. The air between them felt electric, and the tension had now spilled far beyond playful sparring. When the commercial break came, the audience whispered among themselves, clearly aware they were witnessing one of those unscripted moments that would be replayed endlessly online. But the cameras caught the tail end of an off-mic exchange between Teddy and Joy. She leaned toward him and said something that made his jaw tighten instantly, though the words weren't clear. Teddy replied with a shake of his head, "You don't know me," before sitting back with arms folded. As the show returned from break, Joy wasted no time returning to the fray. "You know," she began, "there's a certain humility that comes with being in this industry for a while. Some people get it, some don't." Teddy turned toward her, his smile gone, and said flatly, "And some people mistake arrogance for confidence." The audience reacted again, the sound text levels spiking from the sudden noise. It was no longer just uncomfortable, it was magnetic. The clips of the moment would soon flood social media, with debates raging over who was right and who crossed the line. But for Teddy Swims, the choice to walk away had already been made. Finally, Teddy's patience snapped. He removed his earpiece, stood up fully, and placed it on the table. "I'm done," he said, his tone final. Joy blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Oh, come on," she said. "Don't be so sensitive." Teddy shook his head, looking out at the audience. "It's not about being sensitive. It's about not letting somebody disrespect you in front of the world and pretending it's just entertainment." The audience erupted in applause and cheers as he stepped back from the table. One of the other hosts reached out to stop him, but Teddy simply smiled, thanked the audience, and walked toward the exit. The cameras followed him until the stage door swung shut behind him. Joy tried to smooth it over with a joke, but the energy in the room had shifted.